wouldn't it be good if Konami were a reliable name once more? Something you could depend upon for quality, no matter where it was, rather than the miserable, shambling, turd-clogged cistern of a company that we've got these days? Nostalgia for the good days of Konami can be found everywhere you go, even in games that aren't actually by them. Now, the release of a great game like Shredder's Revenge naturally puts their classics back into focus, but even beyond something that direct, you find that call for the real Konami everywhere, anytime there's another smashing Metroidvania, or blistering Contra-esque run and gunner, or just a damn fine arcade-style game. It all ends up going back to something by Konami, a good thing that they used to do. Anywho, I thought that now would be a good opportunity to look back at a little selection of Konami's titles, ones that fit the bill of being both arcade games and licensed games. Konami didn't exactly shove such games down our throats. There's only 9 here, which seems like a ridiculously small amount compared to some of the stuff we've been covering lately, but they're pretty much all quality, some of the best games out there during that awesome arcade period of the late 80s and early 90s. Unbelievably, the high majority of them never made it to a home either. They were left in the arcade, an exclusive attraction that you had to go out and experience, the sort of thing you'd hotly anticipate playing again whenever a trip was on the horizon. Konami's style of arcade game, simple, big on characters, effective, was a match made in heaven for the licensed games they put out there, and so it's worth having a look back at the great stuff they did. And naturally, we're starting with the biggest game of the lot, the one that's once again on everybody's lips. This video is sponsored by NerdCon. Brad Burton, motivational speaker and former games reviewer, has organised an event where generations of gamers will come together at the biggest arcade in Europe, the Arcade Club in Bury, Greater Manchester. It'll be a full day not just of playing games, but of special guest speakers including the legendary Gary Bracey of Ocean Software, debates on the big questions such as whether the ZX Spectrum is better than the C64, and opportunities for people with shared interests to meet each other and have a right good laugh. The fun takes place on Wednesday the 17th of August, and all ticket holders will be entered into a raffle to win a PlayStation 5. If you want to know more or you'd like to buy tickets, you can find everything you need at nerdcon.co.uk, and I thank them for their support on this video. In many ways, there's an unofficial holy trinity of 1989 when it comes to the beat-em-up. The 3 games that made pounding streets and whacking goons the hottest thing going, kicking the genre into overdrive after the likes of Double Dragon laid the groundwork. You've got Capcom's Final Fight, Sega's Golden Axe, and Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Hero Turtles if you're from these parts. And TMNT was unquestionably the biggest of the 3. It came out at the perfect time to really ride the wave that was Turtle Mania in 1990, when you had the movie, the cartoons, the absurd amount of toys, comics, advertising. The 4 Testodyne denizens of Manhattan were everywhere, and Konami rejoiced in its abundance. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was by some distance the biggest arcade game of 1990. It's one that's still more than remembered today. 32 years later, another game's established TMNT as, once again, the biggest thing going in the genre. And while Shredder's Revenge does plenty of cool new stuff, it utterly retains the core that makes this arcade so great, the absolute straightforwardness of the play, and the maniacal multiplayer that consistently brought groups to the big cabinet. Mind you, TMNT was neither Konami's first game using the license, nor was it their first 4-player beat-em-up. Konami were pretty quick to get hold of the Turtles license, picking it up pretty early on, late 1987, at around the same time that the cartoons started airing in America. The Turtles first appeared in game form on the NES in May 1989 through Konami's Ultra Games label, and needless to say this title was pretty successful. Now sure, it's kind of an infamously frustrating bastard of a game, what with its dam level, its corridor-filled technodrome, and a Raphael who is somehow even more useless than the support that April O'Neil offers, but it still sold somewhere in the region of 4 million copies. In fact, it's the best-selling third-party title on the NES. So long as we're talking about the NES title, did you know how crucial the game was to establishing Nintendo in the UK? The NES really didn't do well at all over here at first, being handled very badly by Mattel. However, when Sans Serif took over, they made the decision to pack TMNT in with the NES, creating the Mutant Machine bundle. Nintendo didn't even want this to happen at first, but the pack was a huge turnaround in the NES's UK fortunes, making the console a hot commodity in the Christmas of 1990. As far as the UK goes, it may well be even more important than those games featuring a certain Italian plumber. Naturally, having such a hot game featuring the Turtles on a home console was going to help out an arcade game no end, and for this arcade, Konami decided to expand on a formula they'd already created in another arcade from 1989, that one being Crime Fighters. In many ways, Crime Fighters is Konami's Double Dragon-esque game, and it's not necessarily a brilliant one. The game's sequel, Vendetta, kinda superseded it, and is a considerably better game. However, Crime Fighters was Konami's first 4-player beat-em-up, and it was a very popular unit at the time. You can see how it was a pretty good test run for what Konami were going to do with the Turtles. The team behind the game includes various people who would go on to be responsible for a lot of the other great beat-em-ups and arcades that we're going to see. The likes of director Gen Suzuki and Masahiro Inoue would work on plenty more of these games. The best way to describe the gameplay itself is that it's like Double Dragon, but simplified. You don't have as many moves as you've got in Technos' game, but what you've got is very effective. There's your regular combo, a jump attack, a diving attack, and a special move, along with a little throw that you usually do as a finisher. Enemies die very quickly to the point where they don't even need a health bar, but there's often a ton of them in all shapes and sizes, so you've got to keep moving in order to not get surrounded. And the stages themselves are pretty short too, but absolutely packed full of big moments. Just take the first stage alone. You get the iconic intro, tons of Foot Clan to take on, big balls to avoid, droids coming out the ground, and then a big fight with Rocksteady. There's an awful lot of stuff in that first stage, which is pretty ideal for an arcade, really. It's a great experience whether you've got a bunch of people and you're aiming to complete the whole thing, or if you only had one coin to put into it. That first stage, whether you beat it or not, is definitely going to be worth putting that coin in. The game calms down a little bit from there, but is still basically packed to the gills with cool moments and ever more familiar enemies, not to mention the rest of the Rogues Gallery. Bebop, Baxter Stockman, Cran and more will have to be dealt with before the final fight with Shredder in the Technodrome. It goes without saying that TMNT absolutely nails the license. I mean, it's hard to see how Konami could have done much better. You get all the Turtles, all the familiar characters and settings, some thoroughly appropriate music. It is basically flawless in this regard. Just the attract mode alone is a pretty awesome sight. Again, the visual of the Turtles leaping from the building, theme song blaring out, was enough to get anyone playing. Now of course, anything with the Turtles' name on it in 1990 was going to sell. Konami could have released one of those dreadful bootleg Keek-style games with the Turtles on it, and people would have still played it. But happily, this game is a classic, and one that still holds up, especially if you can find it in a proper arcade setting. And unlike most of the games in this video, the huge popularity of the cabinet meant that there was going to be a whole load of home ports. We may as well talk a little bit about the various ports of TMNT, seeing as we won't be able to do that for most of these games. Most of the contemporary ports for this game are on 8-bit platforms, and naturally that means some things will be pared down a fair bit, but still some ports have their moments. Obviously though, the best port is the one on the NES by quite a long distance. Dubbed Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, to differentiate it from the previous NES title, it's about as good a beat-em-up as you can get on the console. It's smooth as hell, and it doesn't lose anything from the coin-op. In fact, it even adds a couple of levels. It doesn't skimp on enemies either, it's chock full of them. The great music's all there too. In short, it's brilliant, the sort of fine conversion you would expect seeing as Konami handled it themselves. The US version also features a sneaky bit of thoroughly appropriate sponsorship. Pizza Hut's got their branding all over it. A superb beat-em-up conversion, another big hit, and one that spawned its own NES-only sequel in the shape of TMNT 3, The Manhattan Project. That's also a good one, although it is kind of hard. There are also, of course, a whole load of microcomputer versions, the sort of thing I specialise in other words. They're a bit of a mixed bag. While some of the 8-bit micros are clearly very underpowered when it comes to this game, you would be surprised at how well they give it a shot. The Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC versions of the coin-op certainly had a lot of effort put into them. You've got music and sound effects on the C64, and all the moves are intact. The C64 version actually manages to put a good amount of enemies on the screen, which is nice considering that the platform often really does struggle with beat-em-ups. The movement takes a little to get used to, but honestly it's fine once you do. One little disappointment is that while it might look as though the game can be played by 2 players, it actually can't. It appears that feature might have been taken out at the last minute. Still, it's quite good for what it is. The Amstrad version can be played by 2 players, and it also moves pretty nicely for the computer. Sure, it's nowhere near the NES version, but if you had this you wouldn't have been disappointed. There's no music here outside of the title screen, although some was composed and can be found on the disc. It appears as though this might have been dropped due to it slowing the game down way too much. Again though, a fine version. Alas, the Spectrum version is kind of awful. I've featured it a few times and yeah, it's not bad in the speed department, but the actual playability just isn't there at all. It's really frustrating to try and do anything, and it's not particularly impressive in any department. Still, it's not the worst version. The worst version would be the Amiga. Oh, good lord, this one's a disaster. A joke of an effort for a 16-bit conversion. You've got plenty of enemies, but it's so slow and juddery. It actually appears to move worse than the Atari ST version it was based on, and that ST version also had music. This doesn't have anything but very basic sound effects. The colours are horrid, the turtle appears to change their freaking identity in the middle of a move, things like fire hydrants and parking meters are more likely to hurt you when you hit them, the jerkiness is off the charts. Yeah, this one's a stinker. Well, that about does it for these ports, most of which were made by Probe and released by Imageworks, the last game the label released before their parent company, Mirrorsoft, went under the waves. Of course, there are many other arcade emulations of the game. There was one on Xbox Live Arcade, a rather sketchy version hidden on 2004's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus, and it's naturally going to be on the upcoming Cowabunga collection for modern platforms, alongside most every other classic Konami Turtles game. The start of 1990 saw Konami release their take on Aliens in the arcade, a game that I did cover a fair while ago now, but hey, it's always worth another look. It's not exactly timed with anything specific in the franchise, seeing as the film was already 4 years old by this point, but hey ho, it's always worth doing a game based on aliens, isn't it? It kind of fits in with the other side of the franchise, that being the Aliens comics, the toy line by Kenner and so on, that were aimed at children, much more so than the actual film was. Not that a lot of kids weren't able to see Aliens, of course, I sure did back in the day. The Konami take on Aliens is a bit curious and certainly different from earlier games in the franchise that tried to be a whole lot darker and moodier, even with the rather limited tools at their disposal. Instead, this game is bright and colourful. The xenomorphs all come in a whole lot of different colours, and there's even the odd enemy that looks more like a zombie. Oh, and Ripley's had a bit of a dye job as well, with nice blonde hair. So yeah, the game perhaps doesn't have the tense Hadley's Hope atmosphere or anything like that, but it certainly has quite a lot of action. There's thousands of Xenos to splatter at all points, and the game plays like various classic Konami run and gunners. Not so much Contra, more an updated and considerably better version of something like Jailbreak. And naturally, two players can team up for the action, with the first playing as Ripley and the second taking on Corporal Hicks. You even have alternate endings depending on what you choose to do against the alien Queen at the end. It's notable that a portion of the final boss fight features in the game's attract mode. That may seem odd, but hey, I presume Konami thought more people would put their money into the game if they know that they're going to be manning that power loader and shouting "get away from her you bitch" at some point, and they were probably right to do it. Generally, I really enjoy this one. It does seem to have held up quite nicely as well, certainly a great deal better than a lot of the other alien-based games of the time. You do get some neat little vehicle stages where you have to go and rescue Newt that were mysteriously excised from the Japanese version of the game, possibly due to the inclusion of Newt herself breaking Japan's guidelines on portraying child endangerment in games. And you do have a few really awesome bits where you can commandeer a power loader to rip the Xenos and facehuggers to shreds with. It's a nice and fairly brief arcade experience with only a few stages, and it's another game that's pretty generous with the first credit. Generally most Konami arcades are, allowing most people a good 5 minutes or so with that first credit if you're playing a bit more casually, or you're just not that experienced with the game. It's nice to have a few decent weapons as well, particularly the flamethrower, which is always going to give those aliens a pretty tough time. On the whole, yeah, this is a definite gem of an arcade, and very much recommended for those looking for a slightly different sort of alien-based game. Unfortunately, this Aliens game never made it out of the arcade. However, there were certainly plans for it to be released in the home. Not a whole lot of detail exists, but it appears as though there were plans for a version of Aliens to arrive on the Mega Drive. The almighty Jazz Rignall of Mean Machines responded to a letter in the magazine in late 1990 saying that a version for the Mega Drive would probably be out in the middle of 1991. But alas, for whatever reason, it never showed up, and I'm unable to find any reason as to why Konami ditched it. I do wonder if perhaps there was some sort of messy situation with regards to the home console rights to the franchise, something that scuppered ports of the next game, but I certainly can't find anything concrete. It hasn't made it onto any compilations that I can think of either, although it is pretty easy to play this game on MAME and what have you nowadays, and you most certainly should. Next, we go to March 1991 and another beat-em-up that was universally loved at the time. Having rode a big wave of Turtle Mania in 1990, Konami released their take on The Simpsons at just about the time when the first family of Springfield started to hit big, coming right in the middle of the show's second season with all sorts of merchandise appearing everywhere. Everything from figures and lunchboxes to characteristics and of course, Do the Bartman. And of course, there were games. Not just here in the arcade, but on the consoles and computers too. It kind of goes without saying that Konami's arcade game is the best of them by some distance, especially when it comes to Simpsons games from the early 90s. The Simpsons game doesn't exactly reinvent the wheel, it's the same highly successful formula that powered TMNT. The Simpsons bump into Smithers in the middle of a robbery, the prized jewel lands in Maggie's mouth, Smithers decides to nick the baby, and it's up to Bart, Lisa, Homer and Marge to get her back. Once again, as many as 4 players can join the fray and beat up a whole bunch of besuited goons, zombies, rabbits from Matt Groening's comic strip Life in Hell, and plenty other enemies. You have much the same moves as you do in Turtles, and the characters are a bit more diverse. Bart and Lisa are speedy, Homer packs a punch, and Marge, well, Marge is the best character by far, because she twats her opponents with a massive vacuum cleaner and has a ton of range. The Konami formula works just as well here as it does in Turtles. The graphics are brilliant and the presentation really goes the extra mile. Just about every character from the series makes an appearance here and there, and not just the regular ones. You've got the likes of Professor Werner von Braun, who serves as the first level's boss, or Princess Kashmir, who Homer can do a little dance with in Moe's Tavern. Certainly more than enough to satisfy fans of the show, and it all comes with a lot of nice music too. Not the best video game music ever or anything, but very suitable. The actual voices from the show are here too, at least for the Simpsons themselves. Smithers and Mr. Burns were voiced by programmers, but they're still well represented. It's also amusing to note some of the regional differences here, particularly between the Western and Japanese versions. In the Japanese version you can actually add to your health bar, the whole scoring system has changed, and you can even find tiny little nukes dotted around to throw. Yes, you can happily cleanse your opponents with fire every now and again. Mind you, these do appear in the Western game too, thrown around by the final Robo-Burns boss. There's a lot of other fun touches, including a cameo for Konami's earlier Aliens game, and it's fun to play the game often and try to find them all. The Simpsons game was quite rightly a huge success. This was the third biggest arcade of 1991, only beaten by the Neo Geo MVS and Street Fighter II. Just like Turtles, it was the sort of machine that you could find in just about every arcade, and it'd often have people huddled around it. Many folks have stories of their well-worn local machine, the sort where the controls for the more popular characters, usually Bart and Homer, would be knackered due to how often they were used. Ah well, like I said, Marge is the best character anyway. It's a tremendous game, of course. While there are certainly some other very good Simpsons games, from the almighty Hit and Run to the Crazy Taxi-esque Road Rage and EA's more in-depth title, this is still the best one for me. And therefore it is a shame that, again, like a lot of other titles in this video, you would struggle to find it in the home. Although the Simpsons arcade wasn't wholly absent from the more intimate setting. I'm pretty sure that the reason for the Simpsons arcade not coming home is straightforward. At the time of its release, the console rights for the show were held by Acclaim, who were busy releasing such utterly classic and riveting titles such as Bart vs the Space Mutants, which you could play on basically everything.
Oh, by the way, I was being sarcastic.
And so no Mega Drive or SNES version, I'm afraid. However, the home computer rights were still around, and Konami got them. Meaning that, thanks to Nova Trade, you can play The Simpsons on PC-DOS and, amazingly, the Commodore 64. The DOS version is a bit of a mixed bag. The graphics and movement aren't too bad, although the music is kinda terrible and a bit of a letdown. On the whole though, it doesn't play too awfully, and it does pretty much feature everything down to the arcade's minigames. The C64 version is kind of the real gem though. Sure, it's a ridiculously underpowered system and a very late game, but it's kind of amazing to see it here at all, particularly in a form that's actually quite playable where you've still got all the moves and even the cutscenes from the arcade kicking around. Yes, it is a little bit slow and all of that, but damn it, it's certainly trying. I think the C64's version of TMNT is better, but it's still good for a beat 'em up on here. Probably the saddest thing, to be honest, is that it's quite tricky to play the game officially nowadays. It was on XBLA and PSN in emulated form thanks to Backbone, but that's long been delisted. EA did release a rather bastardised take on the game for iOS, a sequel of a sort, called The Simpsons Arcade, at around the same time their bigger Simpsons game came out where you can only play as Homer, but that's also delisted. There is a 2021 Arcade 1-Up home cabinet release of the game, of course, but as far as something smaller goes, yeah, you're kind of out of luck at present, at least officially. Thank goodness for MAME then. Naturally, Konami's biggest arcade license was going to get a sequel at some point, and sure enough, September of 1991 would see the release of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time. The evil Shredder and Krang have conspired to steal the Statue of Liberty. They even had the chutzpah to do it right in the middle of April O'Neil's news report. Needless to say, the Turtles have to nail these bastards, and they'll do so in an adventure that will take you from New York to a journey through the whole of time. Dinosaurs, pirates, the Wild West. As one of the levels puts it, it's an adventure to where no turtle has gone before. Once again, it's a big old 4-player beat-em-up that, on the surface of things, isn't going to change an awful lot about what worked so well in the original TMNT, but Turtles in Time has plenty enough that's new about it for it to shine on its own merits. Turtles in Time certainly has a lot more flashy panache. Our heroes in a half shell have got a bunch more moves to play with, including a dash attack and a couple of thoroughly iconic grabs, whether it's slamming a foot soldier from left to right, or, most famously, throwing them directly at the screen. The levels are also a lot fancier too. The first utterly classic level, Big Apple 3am, features all sorts of big moments, from the gigantic Krang and his laser eyes, to the big balls and the fight with Baxter Stockman, plus some legendary music to go along with it. And yet, it just continues from there. Turtles in Time may not be too different to the original, but it kind of does beat it in every way. An absolutely magnificent beat 'em up, and yet another one that enjoyed a great deal of thoroughly deserved success. In fact, it might be the best game in this whole video. And not all of that has to do with the arcade version.
Forgot the sun cream.
Turtles in Time is most certainly blessed by also having one of the greatest home console ports there has ever been. A port that is so good, it's perhaps even more famous than the arcade original. It would be interesting to find out how many people think of Turtles in Time as a SNES game than they do an arcade title, but a lot of that has to do with how fantastic the port is. It quite simply doesn't put a foot wrong. Redubbed TMNT for Turtles in Time to continue the lineage from the NES's exclusive Turtles game, absolutely everything from the arcade is here. You would really struggle to find anything that the game misses out on, and even the graphics aren't really a whole lot different. One of the system's best soundtracks? Yep, we got that too. Turtles in Time is an all-timer in this department, the best music in the whole video, and it's beautifully done on the SNES. The port even adds a whole bunch of things. A couple of new stages, a legendary fight with Shredder where you chuck those foot soldiers directly at him. What a great port this is, seriously. One of those SNES games everyone remembers thanks to its stonking success and simply how good it was. It's no wonder a few people think of it as their favourite SNES game, really. Turtles in Time is still pretty much the pinnacle of the Turtles in video games, and it has to be on the shortlist of the very greatest beat-em-ups of all time. It's essentially flawless. Now, while the Mega Drive didn't get its own version of Turtles in Time, it did get the Hyperstone Heist, and that game is quite a lot like Turtles in Time, albeit with a slightly rejigged plot. Konami's first release on the MD features the new and improved Toytles, a bunch of stages, cutscenes and music from Turtles in Time, plus a little bit from the original and a few stages entirely of its own. I guess you could call it a rearranged version of Turtles in Time. It does sadly miss out on chucking enemies into the screen, and on the whole it isn't quite as good as the SNES game, but it's still a fine beat 'em up in its own right. I kind of remember a few magazines, UK ones at least, being rather sniffy about Hyperstone when it came out, giving it pretty low ratings. But over the years it's built up a following, and it's now regarded as one of the MD's finest beat 'em ups. And it must be said, it's got the price to match that. Excellent game. As far as more modern ways to play these games go, well, like the original, Turtles in Time was a hidden extra on a 6th generation Turtles game, TMNT 3 The Mutant Nightmare this time around, and again it's got a few unfortunate changes to the music and a lack in emulation. There was also the 2009 remake of the game for XBLA and PSN, Turtles in Time Reshelled, that, yeah, it wasn't particularly good, and the graphics have aged like fine milk. It sold well despite that, but it has been delisted since 2011. Happily, you'll be able to play the arcade and SNES versions of Turtles in Time, as well as Hyperstone Heist, on the upcoming Cowabunga collection. Konami weren't just going to hold things down when it came to the Turtles, oh no. They'd make games for the various cartoons that followed in its wake. Now, before some people start shouting, yes, it is a bit unfair to call Bucky O'Hare a Turtles imitation, seeing as the original Larry Hama and Michael Golden comic is a contemporary of the original TMNT comic, with both coming out in 1984. In fact, the creation of the character itself actually predates the Turtles by several years. That said, the big Bucky O'Hare push from 1991 onwards, complete with cartoon, big Hasbro toy line, and Konami produced games? Yeah, that probably doesn't happen if it's not for the huge success of those Turtles. In any case, it's all about the games nowadays, and, shock of horrors, the Bucky O'Hare arcade game is really freaking good. The game that we end up with here is actually a bit closer to Aliens than it is to Turtles. We've got the big 4-player cabinet and the typical cartoon graphics, but be warned, because our heroes are now armed with shooters. You and your mates can play as either Bucky himself, Deadeye Duck, Jenny and Blinky, and you blast those evildoers of the Toad Empire to Kingdom Come through 8 stages that are, of course, utterly teeming with them. The game is ridiculously action-packed. If you were to consider this as a sort of sequel to Aliens in terms of gameplay, then it's an improvement in all departments, and it's not like that game's a slouch. You'll be flying along at points, doing the odd bit of platforming, avoiding traps, riding the obligatory elevator, and there'll certainly be big boss battles. The design and animation are thoroughly on point, and the actual voice actors from the cartoon are, once again, on hand. Bucky O'Hare certainly does follow Konami's formula to the letter, but it is a great formula, and it makes for another exceptional arcade. As the memory of this series has faded, it's not as well known as the likes of Turtles and Simpsons, but it's not exactly far off from them. As you might expect, this version of Bucky O'Hare didn't make it home, and it doesn't appear as though a conversion of this game was planned at any point. With that said, it's worth noting that Konami released a NES game based on Bucky O'Hare in the same year, and said game is an absolute belter. It is more of a classic NES style platformer, in the vein of Mega Man and whatnot, but a very high quality example. You also have all the same playable characters as you get in the arcade, plus Willy DeWitt, although Bucky has to rescue them first. Once you rescue a character, you can switch to and from them at any time during a stage. One curious thing about this title is that it's amongst a small number of Konami games that could be, unofficially, considered treasure games, alongside the likes of Contra 3 and Axlay on the SNES. Almost everyone who worked on the NES Bucky O'Hare would go on to form Treasure later in the year, including the game's director and eventual company founder, Masato Maegawa. Neither the arcade or NES Bucky O'Hare have ever had any kind of re-release, and it would probably be silly to expect that they will anytime soon. If you fancy a copy of the NES game, you should probably be prepared to sell off a kidney or two in order to afford the bastard. The next one is possibly the most obscure of the games featured in this video. It doesn't seem as though Konami's take on the almighty Asterix really registered all that much back in the day, which is a bit of a shame. It's probably not even the most famous of the games that star the almighty Gallic hero and puncher of Romans, although it would definitely have a good shout at being the best of the Asterix games. Once again, we've got the typical Konami formula for a beat-em-up, although naturally there's only 2 players this time. You play as either Asterix or Obelix, his big brother from another mother, and your mission is basically to find as many Romans as possible and give them a solid punch-in, all the while scranning down loads of wild boar and getting the odd bit of help from your pet dogmatics. It's kind of as straightforward as it gets for an arcade beat-em-up, and it's not like you need too much else from Asterix and Obelix. Once again, this is a game that gets by on how well it represents these rather famous characters. Like most of these games, it does an absolutely smashing job of that. I absolutely adore most of the attacks that you have at your disposal, particularly Obelix's ones. He starts every stage by carrying an absolutely massive bloody rock that he can flatten legions with, so what's not to love? Our heroes can grab enemies and slap them about, twirl them over their head or bash them from left to right without a care in the world, give them a right good kick up the arse, and do a really special power punch that's quite handy against a lot of the game's bosses. It all feels very right. It essentially feels like playing through the Asterix and Obelix comic, and that's most certainly what the game was going for. It may not have been the biggest of Konami games, perhaps due to the lack of familiarity certain audiences had with the characters, but it is a blinder. And hey, I'm sure it was utterly frickin' gigantic in France. If you don't know this one, and you like the classic Konami beat-em-ups, then yeah, you should absolutely fire this one up in MAME. Obviously, MAME is the only way to play this short of seeking out an original board. This has never been re-released, and it was never ported. Those fine French folk at Infogrames held the console and computer rights for Asterix, so there was no Konami Asterix console game, either a port of this one or anything else. There is an interesting tidbit about this game's development, mind you. The game's director is none other than the rather mysterious Hitoshi Akamatsu, the man who created Castlevania. Akamatsu is an elusive figure who never gave interviews and has long disappeared from the industry, but he moved back to Konami's arcade division following Castlevania 3. While he's credited as a director on Asterix, a recent Wireframe article about Akamatsu reveals that he wasn't quite fit for that job. The game's co-director, Masaki Kikuno, said that he pretty much had to do the direction himself and take all the big decisions. Akamatsu left Konami in the middle of the development of another arcade called Slam Dunk, and very little is known of him after that. April of 1992 sees the release in the arcades of G.I. Joe, another gem by Konami that was exclusively found on those sticky cigarette butt-filled floors. This game's a little different to the others in this video. It's another run and gun type shooter, but it's a scaling one where you run forwards into the screen. You play as one of 4 G.I. Joe operatives, Duke, Snake Eyes, Scarlet or Roadblock, and as is often the case, you can have as many as 4 players, which makes for a pretty wild game of Cobra Goon murdering and scenery destruction, of which there is plenty. You'll mainly be using your regular gun and moving your crosshairs about, but you can also get rapid fire power-ups and missiles that are pretty handy for taking down the bigger enemies and crowds. Nice. In terms of gameplay, G.I. Joe is an unofficial sequel to a 1988 Konami arcade called Devastators. Hell, it's so similar in parts that you could think of it as a remake. The original Devastators expands on a concept found in Contra's base stages. A similar view, only you run into the screen and there's scaling. Not a bad game, but it has some flaws. The regular weapon is a pea shooter, and much like Contra it's not best served by being presented in portrait mode, or Tate mode as it's also known. G.I. Joe is a far better game. You've got a much more appropriate aspect ratio and a lot more power in your weapons, but the big addition is most certainly the amount of scenery destruction. If you can see it, chances are pretty good that you can blow it the hell up. And well, why wouldn't you? It is important to beat Cobra so frickin' hard that there is essentially no trace left of them, especially those oil tanks that are textured like Amiga Boing balls. This is a thoroughly appealing bit of shoot-em-up action, and it does make for a nice change of pace from the main sort of games that we've got in this video. These were the times when Konami released little but gold no matter what they were doing, after all. If it feels like that was a long time ago, well, that's because it was. Sorry to tell you that.
Yo, Joe!
The bad news is, of course, that this G.I. Joe didn't come out in the home, although that's perhaps not surprising. This is one of those games from that very awkward 1992 time. It's too advanced for either the Mega Drive or the SNES to really do much justice to it, and by the time a console comes out that would have handled it nicely, well, the game's a couple of years old already, and everyone's moved on. The Revenge of Death Adder problem, in other words. In fact, it is surprising to find that this is Konami's only G.I. Joe game. I could have sworn that they did the two NES games based on Joe, but the first was from Taxan, and the second game, The Atlantis Factor, came from Capcom. I guess that's another reason why we didn't see a port of this one. The licensing for G.I. Joe looks like it was an absolute bloody mess. As you might have guessed, MAME or some other arcade emulation is your only option for playing this title, and it's absolutely one that you should play if you've not touched it before. We move along to another one of the more obscure Konami arcade licenses, and the game that is probably the weakest one in this video, although it is still quite decent on the whole. And naturally, it's a license that falls into the Turtles rip-off category. Yes, Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa is a much more blatant take on the winning formula, being that it's a quite short-lived cartoon series that was created by Ryan Brown, who was previously known for his work on the original Turtles comic. The series itself only lasted from 1992 to 93 and hasn't exactly stuck around in the public conscience, but it did hang around long enough to get a Konami game. In fact, Konami kind of got in on the ground level here. The game came out in November 1992, fast enough for the show to still be in the middle of its first season at the time of release. I guess that Konami were hoping for the show to be as big a hit as the Turtles was, but in this case, it wasn't to be. The series itself is this weird Wild West riff where a comet turns a whole community into these cow-human hybrids, and the result is a Wild West style town where typical Wild West stories happen, only everything is bovine. As far as Konami goes, said Wild West setting means that this is the unofficial sequel to a much more famous and better game by them. Cowboys of Moo Mesa is the follow-up to the almighty Sunset Riders. Now that game is one of Konami's most legendary of the whole period, 4-player run and gun action at its best, with tons of great set pieces, legendary bosses with famous speech samples. It's got the lot. Needless to say, these Cowboys of Moo Mesa have a pretty freaking tough act to follow here, and comparing this game to Sunset Riders isn't going to do it any favours at all, because it just can't match up. However, it's not exactly bad. You can play as Marshall Moo Montana, the Colorado Kid, the Dakota Dude or Buffalo Bull, and you get to take down various members of the show's rogues gallery. It is certainly faithful to the show's style, which is down to the close involvement of Ryan Brown himself in the game's development. It looks very nice indeed. The main run and gun gameplay is perfectly fine, with no troubles if you're already a Sunset Riders fan, but the game falters a bit in the odd flying stages that are a bit of a pain to play, and with a lot of the bosses. Most of them are kind of dull, and they're little but bullet cushions that take way too long to kill in this single player mode. It's just these minor things that take the game down a couple of pegs. That said, yeah, it's not a bad game at all. It's more of an intriguing curio than an essential title, but I had a bit of fun with it. Obviously, MAME is your only option here. This was never ported to anything, and it is the only Wild West Cowboys of Moo Mesa game that there ever was. Shocking, I know. And so we get to the final arcade game in the video. Another big and memorable cabinet housing another quite popular beat-em-up. It's the turn of the X-Men. It is certainly a lot less riskier to do a game based on this lot than it is to do one on those Wild West cowboys. I mean, there had already been a few X-Men games by this point. Who can forget titles like The Uncanny X-Men on the NES, after all? Naturally, this game is certainly a bit better than that one, although, no surprises here, it didn't make it to a home system, at least not for a good 18 years or so. X-Men goes back to the dependable formula that works. It's a good old-fashioned beat-em-up. The difference here, of course, is that X-Men is just that little bit bigger than the rest. Yes, this is the game that can feature a grand total of 6 players at once, depending on the cabinet. You and 5 of your friends can choose between Wolverine, Colossus, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Storm and Dazzler, and naturally you've got to stop Magneto and his gang of goons from wreaking havoc on the world. You'll be fighting the likes of Wendigo, Pyro and the Juggernaut before getting to the Big M himself. As was the case with Konami's other big multiplayer beat-em-ups, you may find that too many people have got to the most popular characters before you did. The controls for Wolverine and Cyclops might possibly be knackered, but the controls for Dazzler are most assuredly near mint. If you're playing on the 6-player cabinet, it comes in a different resolution in order to accommodate the sheer amount of things going on. It's a double wide game, with 2 monitors inside the cabinet. One in the normal spot you would expect, the other inside the cabinet and reflected onto the screen to create the appropriate effect. Nice, eh? When you play this on MAME or wherever, you might well think that some things do suffer a bit in order to get this 6-player action going on. The game does only run in 30 FPS after all, and perhaps there could be a bit more variation in the enemies from time to time. Still, it's certainly no slouch when it comes to the sheer amount of goons. There's tons, and battering them up is certainly a good laugh. There's not a whole load of attacks, but you do get a special mutant power that helps clear the screen a bit when needed. Be wary, mind you, as deploying it naturally results in losing a bit of life. Happily, all the iconic X-Men moves are here, which honestly wasn't always the case with games from the franchise. Wolverine's always got his claws out, Cyclops shoots those lasers from his eyes, Nightcrawler dashes around and chins everything in seconds, and Dazzler fires energy from her hands. You can also kick people's heads in on the ground, and there's an attack and jump move as well. So yeah, you've got the usual Konami tools of the trade. X-Men is, once again, another fine beat-em-up, even if it's a formula we've seen a good few times at this point. It's not quite as good as the likes of Turtles in Time, but it's certainly doing an awful lot, and it does have the odd fun moment, whether it's the cheesy voice samples that occasionally display a rather questionable grasp of English, or the simple act of punching Pyro in the mouth in the middle of his obligatory villain speech.
X-Men, welcome to die!
It's all good, clean fun, and it made for another popular arcade. And of course, you couldn't play it at home. It's another game that was perhaps a bit too advanced for the home machines of the time. It did come home for a little bit thanks to an emulated version by Backbone available on XBLA and PSN in 2010, but this was delisted in 2013. All of these Konami beat-em-ups were on a limited license, and so they were all gone again after a couple of years. An arcade 1-up cabinet is around, featuring X-Men alongside Data East's Captain America and the Avengers and Avengers in Galactic Storm, but other than that, yeah, it's MAME all away. And it's a nice way to wrap things up here. Another good punch-a-thon that keeps up a very high standard. It is perhaps a little surprising that, in the end, we only have 9 games to show here, even if they are just about all worth playing at the very least. There are a couple of other licenses that Konami had where it's almost a bit of a surprise to not have an arcade version of the game, after all. What about their absolutely fantastic Batman Returns beat-em-up? An arcade version of that would have been more than able to hand with this video's best. Or TMNT Tournament Fighters, which is actually a not too bad attempt at the old Street Fighter formula, at least on the SNES anyway. And if you're looking for another Turtles rip-off, well, there's Biker Mice from Mars, which arrived on the SNES in the form of an actually very cool isometric racing game. All of these games are very decent indeed, but they were only made for the home consoles. Still, the games that we've ended up covering here comprise a group containing some of the late 80s and early 90s greatest arcades, and it's nice to have a video that contains absolutely nothing that's even approaching the land of badness. Hopefully you've enjoyed the look back at these cabinets, and it is once again time to say, as ever, bye for now.
Cowabunga!